snow lashed the servants' entrance of the Black Hart Inn as two guards dragged an old woman through the mud like something the kitchen had thrown out. She made no sound beyond a thin, broken breath. Her coat was soaked through. Her white hair clung to her face in frozen strands. One hand clutched a scrap of lace so tightly that even in her half-conscious state, her fingers would not release it. The crowd gathered at a careful distance. The way people gather around accidents they are relieved are not their own. No one moved toward her. No one spoke in her defense. Then a girl in a torn servant shawl burst through the edge of the crowd and threw herself over the old woman's body. Mara Ellison hit the frozen ground on her knees and spread her arms wide, and the guard stumbled back a step from sheer surprise. People did not do this. Not in Ravenshade. Not when the guards wore the Caromere crest. Please. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She is sick. She cannot harm anyone. The taller guard looked down at her the way men look at things stuck to their boots. Move aside, girl. This is no business of yours. She is an old woman in the snow. That makes it everyone's business. The second guard reached down and seized Mara's arm hard enough to bruise.
You filthy beggar! Do you know whose orders we carry?
I know she is burning with fever, and you are dragging her across
cobblestones. She wrenched her arm free and pressed closer over the old woman, close enough to feel the violent shaking beneath that soaked coat, close enough to see the scrap of lace the woman clutched. The crowd pressed in. Torchlight moved across the scene in orange waves. A coachman climbed his box for a better view. Two women near the inn steps whispered rapidly behind their hands. It was then that Mara saw it. The lace handkerchief, torn at one corner and dark with grime, bore an embroidered crest in its center, a coronet above two crossed keys. She knew that crest. Everyone in the county knew that crest. She had seen it stamped on eviction notices, pressed into wax on court summons, carved into the stone gate of the most feared estate in all of England. Caromere. The world seemed to tilt beneath her knees. She looked at the old woman's face. The bones of it, even under fever and filth, held something. A bearing. A structure. Something that did not belong in the mud behind a market inn. The guards reached for her again. And in that moment, hoofbeats struck the cobblestones. The crowd parted. A tall figure in a black riding coat dismounted at the courtyard entrance, pulling one leather glove off finger by finger with the unhurried precision of a man who had never once been told to hurry. Duke Edmund Caromere. He surveyed the scene with cold, flat eyes, took in the old woman, the kneeling girl, and the guards, and spoke without raising his voice. Remove her. Now. The guards straightened instantly. One seized Mara's arm. The other reached for Agnes. And the words left Mara's mouth before fear could stop them. Do not touch her. Her voice rang across the courtyard. She is your mother. The Duke stopped mid-step. The crowd went silent so completely that the torch flames seemed loud. The guards froze. The coachman forgot to breathe. Somewhere behind the watching faces, a horse stamped once and was still. No one in Ravenshade had spoken of his mother in 16 years. Not one soul. The silence stretched until it became something solid. The old woman's hand lifted, trembling, and her fingers opened. The handkerchief fell into the snow between them, crest upward, impossible to ignore. Her cracked lips parted, and in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke a name. Not his title. Not his surname. A name no document had ever recorded. The name only one person in the world had ever called him. The Duke's face went the color of winter stone. The chapter ends here in the hook, and opens again several hours earlier, in the cold and ordinary life that brought Mara Ellison to that courtyard. Ravenshade woke each morning wearing its poverty like clothing it had long stopped noticing. The market lanes smelled of old fish and coal smoke. Gutters ran gray beside shop fronts that had not been repainted since the old king's time. Children with thin wrists chased scraps near the baker's bins, and the bakers watched them without much feeling either way. The town was not cruel by design. It was simply practiced at looking past what it could not afford to fix. No one understood that practice better than Mara Ellison. There had been a time when her mornings began with a purpose someone else had set. She had been a housemaid at Fenwick Manor, a respectable position with a proper uniform, regular meals, and the particular dignity of knowing exactly where she belonged. She had been good at her work, thorough and quiet and willing, the kind of servant employers forgot to thank because her presence felt inevitable. Then the steward, a man named Greer with soft hands and careful smiles, began skimming wages from the lower staff. A shilling here, two there, adjustments he explained with paperwork no one below stairs could properly read. When the housekeeper asked Mara to confirm his accounting before the mistress of the house, Mara told the truth. She was dismissed without a reference before the week was out. Greer remained. That was 8 months ago. Now Mara rose each morning from beneath a broken section of washhouse roof behind the East Market, where two walls met at an angle just wide enough to keep the worst of the rain off a sleeping body. She owned a blanket, a tin cup, a spare pair of stockings with holes in both heels, and the shawl she had been wearing the day she left Fenwick. She had sold her good boots in November for bread and a bundle of dried herbs. The shoes she wore now had belonged to a dead woman and were half a size too large. She stuffed them with rags and kept walking. Her days followed whatever work the town was willing to spare. She scrubbed floors at the fishmonger's before dawn, where the cold water numbed her hands past feeling within the first few minutes. She carried coal to the bakery on Midden Lane, loading the heavy sacks onto a barrow and pushing it up the hill while merchants on horseback clattered past without slowing. She swept the steps of the Anchor Tavern each afternoon in exchange for whatever the kitchen could spare, which was usually a heel of bread and sometimes a cup of never reliable if the cook was in a generous mood. Not to count on tomorrow before today was finished. What she had not learned, and suspected she never would, was indifference. She gave the smaller half of her bread to the hollow-faced children near the fountain even when hunger made her hands shake. She wrapped a strip torn from her spare stocking around the paw of a limping dog she saw 3 mornings in a row near the market gate. She once lost a full afternoon of coal work helping an elderly flower seller gather stems scattered by a passing cart, holding each one up to the light to see what could still be sold. People in Ravenshade had stopped seeing her as a person some months back. She had crossed that invisible line where poverty stops being a circumstance and becomes an identity. Men stepped around her. Women drew their skirts aside. Children stared until their mothers pulled them away. She was not dangerous or unpleasant. She was simply easier to ignore than to reckon with. Above the rooftops of the lower market, Carrowmere Hall sat on its hill like a closed fist. She could see its towers from almost anywhere in town, gray stone against gray sky, windows lit at night like something watching. People in Ravenshade spoke of the Duke the way they spoke of winter, not as a man exactly, but as a condition. Duke Edmund Carrowmere. He had inherited the estate at 19 and had governed it with a precision that left no room for softness. Tenants who fell behind on rent received notices, then removal. Servants dismissed from his household found that no reference followed them. Merchants who crossed his solicitors discovered that memory in that house was long and patience was short. Whether he was cruel by nature or by design, Mara could not say. She had never seen him. She only knew what the town knew, and what the town knew was enough to keep most people from looking too long at his gates. By late afternoon the sky had turned the color of old pewter and the snow that had threatened all day began to fall in earnest. Mara had earned 3 pennies and a bruised pear by the time the market started emptying. She ate the pear slowly beside the east fountain, watching the last carts pull away and the last shopkeepers drag their shutters closed. Her bread was gone. She had 1 coin left after spending 2 on a twist of dried rosemary from the herb woman, who sometimes took pity on her and charged less than it was worth. She was turning toward the washhouse when she passed the rear of the Black Hart Inn. The Black Hart was the finest establishment in Ravenshade, the sort of place that served hot suppers on white cloths and stabled horses better than most families slept. Light poured from its tall windows. The smell of roasted meat rolled out through a cracked kitchen door and settled over the alley like a small cruelty. Mara was halfway past when she heard something beneath the noise of the inn. Not a word. Not a call. Just a sound, thin and low, the sound a person makes when they have given up expecting anyone to come. She stopped. She stepped back. Behind the wooden steps that led up to the servants' entrance, half hidden by a collapsed pile of empty crates, an old woman lay in the snow. Her coat had once been good, Mara could see that much. The collar was cut with care, and what remained of the lining was fine wool, though both were now soaked through and dark with cold. Her face was the color of candle wax. Her breathing came in shallow, effortful pulls, as though each one required a separate decision. One hand, thin-fingered and trembling, pressed against her chest. In it she clutched a scrap of lace. A kitchen boy came out through the servant's door, took one look, and went back inside. A woman in an apron followed, assessed the situation with a single glance, muttered something about the same old trouble, and returned to her pots. A man in a traveling coat stepped over the old woman's feet without breaking stride. Mara knelt in the snow. "Can you hear me?" The woman's eyelids moved. Not fully open, but enough. Her lips parted and she made a sound that might have been a word in another life. "I am going to help you up." It was harder than it should have been. The woman was not large, but she had no strength to assist, and the snow made everything slick. Mara got an arm beneath her shoulders and lifted, braced herself against the step, and pulled. Twice she nearly went down herself. Her empty stomach made her dizzy and her shoes slipped on the ice, but she set her jaw and kept going. 3 streets, 2 narrow lanes, and 1 long frozen alley later, she had the old woman inside the washhouse shelter, laid on Mara's blanket over a bed of dry sacking. She built a small fire in the rusted basin she kept for cold nights, using the last of the coal scraps she had set aside. She warmed water in the dented tin pot. She had no medicine, but she had the rosemary and a fold of dried mint leaf she carried in her pocket, and she brewed them into something hot and bitter and pressed it to the woman's lips a little at a time. Her own supper, the last of the bread she had been saving since morning, she broke apart and softened in warm water and fed to the old woman in careful fragments. The woman ate slowly, the way fever allows, more reflex than intention. When the bread was gone there was nothing left to give, and Mara sat back on her heels and pulled the second half of her blanket over her own shoulders and settled in for the night. The old woman slept fitfully. She murmured through the dark hours, half sentences and broken names, the accent of someone raised with tutors and good silver. Once she said something that sounded like a place name, an estate somewhere south. Once she said a man's name, older, formal, said with a grief that had lived long enough to become quiet. And once, close to midnight, she turned her head and said, in a voice that was almost clear, almost present, "Edmund. My Edmund." Mara did not know anyone named Edmund. She tucked the thought away beside the handkerchief she had noticed when she first moved the woman, that scrap of lace with the embroidered crest she had pressed carefully beneath a loose stone in the wall for safekeeping. She did not sleep much. By the time pale light came through the gap in the broken roof, the woman's fever had dropped slightly, and she was breathing with less effort. She had opened her eyes once in the night and looked at Mara with an expression so full of confused tenderness that Mara had to look away. "Agnes," the woman said when Mara asked her name. "Just Agnes. Nothing more." Dawn had barely reached the rooftops when the first poster appeared on the market gate. By the time the fish stalls opened, there were a dozen. By mid-morning, they covered half the walls in raven shade. Mara saw one from across the lane and her stomach dropped before she had finished reading it. Wanted. Dangerous elderly impostor. By order of Caromere Hall. A reward in bold letters at the bottom. A number large enough to make an honest man dishonest before breakfast. The town changed within the hour. People who had ignored the old woman last night were now suddenly full of theories about where she might be found. The reward did what cold weather and good sense could not. It made everyone helpful. Mara returned to the washhouse and moved Agnes deeper inside, behind what remained of the altar wall of the old outbuilding, covering her with the darker blanket and pressing a finger to her lips when Agnes tried to speak. Agnes looked at her with eyes that were clearer than yesterday, sharper, troubled. "They are looking for me," she said. Not a question. "Yes. You should leave me. What I carry will bring danger to anyone near me. You cannot walk yet." That is not an argument against leaving. It is the only one I need. Agnes looked at her for a long moment. Then something in her face settled, not peace exactly, but the decision to trust, which is its own kind of courage. By afternoon the rumors had found direction. Someone had seen a girl carrying something heavy toward the East Market the previous night. Someone else remembered the washhouse. The Duke's men came in a group of 6, horses and boots and the particular noise of authority moving without patience. Mara heard them before she saw them. She had barely stood before 2 guards filled the doorway, and then there was nowhere to go and no time left to think. They took Agnes by the arms. The old woman made no sound, but her face went white, and her hand reached out once in Mara's direction before they pulled her into the lane. Mara followed without being invited. When a 3rd guard tried to block her, she walked around him, and when a 4th put a hand on her shoulder, she turned with enough steadiness in her eyes that he hesitated, and that half-second was enough to keep moving. They dragged Agnes toward the Black Hart Inn courtyard, where the guards' horses were tied and where a black traveling coach sat beside the gate with its doors still open. And there, in the center of the courtyard, still in his riding coat with snow on the shoulders, stood Duke Edmund Caromir. He was taller than the stories made him. His face was hard and still and gave nothing away. He looked at Agnes with the particular expression of a man who has decided what he believes and intends to keep believing it regardless of evidence. He looked at Mara the way he did not look at her at all. The guards forced Agnes forward. The old woman stumbled and caught herself on the arm of one of them with the involuntary grace of someone who had once known how to enter a room. She lifted her face toward the Duke. And the Duke, despite himself, paused. Mara stepped forward. "Your Grace." Her voice came out steady. She was faintly surprised. "This woman is ill. Whatever you believe about her, she is not well enough to be handled like this." "You have already exceeded your role here," he said, without looking at her. "I do not have a role. I have eyes." That made him look. He studied her for a moment with something close to curiosity, then returned his gaze to Agnes. Agnes, who was looking at him the way a woman looks at someone she has not seen in 16 years and feared she never would again. Agnes, whose hand was still clutching the torn lace handkerchief that had fallen partly open, the Caromir crest showing plain in the torchlight. Mara's voice cut through the courtyard one more time. "Do not touch her." She stepped forward and spread herself between the guards and the old woman, the same way she had in the mud, the same stubborn, impossible posture. "She is your mother." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. The rings spread outward in every direction. Not a sound. Not a breath. The guards looked at the Duke. The Duke had gone completely still, one hand raised mid-gesture, his face a thing she could not read. Agnes lifted her head. Her voice came thin and certain and full of 16 years of waiting. She said his name. The childhood name. The one only she had ever used. The Duke's raised hand lowered slowly to his side. For one unguarded moment, something moved across his face that was nothing like the man Ravenshade had spent years fearing. Then it was gone, and the stillness returned harder than before. He looked at the guards. He looked at Mara. He looked, finally and at length, at the old woman in the snow. "Bring them both to Caromir Hall," he said. Chapter 2. The Prisoner at Caromir Hall. Caromir Hall announced itself before the carriage reached the gates. Torches lined the long approach road, burning in iron brackets spaced with military precision, as though even the light was required to stand at attention. The walls rose from the hill like something grown rather than built, dark stone climbing into a sky that had stopped snowing but not yet forgiven the cold. Mara pressed her face briefly to the carriage window and saw the gate open inward without anyone visible pulling it, operated by some mechanism she could not identify, and she thought that was the most honest thing about this place she would ever see. Everything here moved by forces you were not meant to understand. Inside, the entrance hall was warm in temperature and cold in every other sense. Marble floors reflected the chandeliers above them with perfect indifference. Portraits of Caromir ancestors covered the walls in gilded frames, each face wearing the same expression of permanent dissatisfaction, as though the family had been disappointed by the world for several generations and had decided to make the world aware of it. Footmen in matching livery stood at intervals along the hall with their eyes forward and their faces arranged into expressions that communicated nothing. They were very good at it. Mara was led in through a side entrance, which she understood was a statement. Agnes was carried up the main steps on a chair by 2 footmen, surrounded by a physician and 2 guards, and taken immediately to an upper corridor that Mara was not permitted to follow. She watched Agnes disappear around a landing and felt something loosen with worry in her chest. Then a housekeeper appeared, a tall woman with the posture of someone who had ironed her own spine, and looked Mara over with the expression of a woman handed a problem she had not budgeted for. "You will be washed," she said. "You will be given appropriate clothing. You will speak when addressed and work when directed and make yourself as invisible as your situation allows." Mara was taken below stairs, handed a basin of hot water that she was grateful for in a way she could not have explained to anyone who had not been cold for months, and given a gray dress that was plain and too large at the shoulders but clean. Her own clothes were taken away. She did not ask where. She was assigned a sleeping space in a narrow alcove near the laundry stairs, where the ceiling sloped so sharply that she could only stand upright in the center of the room. A cot, A basin, a single hook on the wall. She had slept in worse. She was still settling onto the cot when heels clicked across the marble above her and descended the servant's stair with the particular rhythm of someone who considered staircases an audience. Lady Rosamund Vale entered the lower corridor as though she were doing it a favor. She was beautiful in the manner of things designed to be looked at, every detail considered, every angle managed. Her gown was the pale green of early spring, too fine for the country and worn here deliberately. Diamonds at her ears. Hair arranged without a strand out of place. She stopped in the corridor outside the alcove and regarded Mara through the open door with an expression of such composed contempt that it almost qualified as artistry. "So this is the girl from the market?" she said. Her voice was pleasant, which made it worse. "The one who caused the scene." "I prevented one," Mara said. Something moved behind Rosamund's eyes. Not anger. Anger would have been simpler. It was the particular attention of a person who has just recategorized a threat. "How resourceful," Rosamund said. She turned to the housekeeper without looking at Mara again. "She is not to move between floors without direction. She is not to approach the Duke. She is not to visit the upper chambers under any circumstance." Then, as though completing a pleasant thought, "Strays require structure. It is a kindness to them." She left. The housekeeper looked at Mara with something that might have been sympathy if sympathy were something she could professionally afford. "Mind yourself," she said quietly and followed. Across the hall, in the eastern study, Duke Edmund Caromere stood before his solicitor with his hands behind his back and his jaw set in the manner of a man controlling something. "She is an impostor," he said. "Your Grace, the handkerchief alone can be stolen, can be forged, can be carried by anyone willing to perform sufficient theater." The solicitor's pen hovered. And the name she used? A pause that lasted slightly too long. Guess. A piece of gossip. My childhood was not a secret to everyone. He turned to the window. Below, the torches on the approach road were being extinguished one by one for the night. "She is confined comfortably?" "Yes, Your Grace. The physician reports the fever is manageable. Good. She will be assessed properly in the morning. Until her identity is conclusively disproved, she is to be treated with basic dignity." He said it the way he said most things, as though the words were decisions rather than feelings, as though if he kept his voice level enough, everything beneath it would agree to stay there. Edmund Caromere had been 9 years old when his mother left. That was how it had been told to him, and he had been too young and too devastated and too dependent on the man who told it to question the telling. Lord Varick had been his father's most trusted advisor, a man of middle age with careful manners and a gift for making his own interests sound like other people's needs. When the Duke's father collapsed of a fever 3 months after his wife's disappearance, Varick stepped into the space that grief had opened and filled it with authority. He managed the estate. He managed the household. He managed the boy. He taught young Edmund that love was a form of exposure, that sentiment was how weak men were controlled, that the purpose of a title was to make the world legible and safe, and that the world was only legible if you refused to be surprised by it. He was an excellent teacher. The Duke he produced was precise, powerful, and impenetrable. Ravenshade feared him because he gave them nothing to appeal to. He did not get angry in ways that could be negotiated with. He did not show favorites. He did not make exceptions. He had evicted tenants because the law said he could and because he had decided long ago that allowing exceptions to rules was how you ended up at the mercy of other people's stories. He believed this. He had been believing it for 20 years. And yet, Mara had been at Caromere Hall for 3 days when she first watched the Duke go still in a way that had nothing to do with control. She had been carrying a coal scuttle through the Upper East Corridor, a task assigned to her because the housekeeper had run out of legitimate reasons to object and needed her occupied, when she heard Agnes's voice through the partially open door of the confined chamber. Agnes was speaking to the physician, or perhaps to herself, in the vague and wandering way that fever sometimes left behind even after the temperature dropped. She said something about a garden, about a boy who refused to wear his coat in February, about how she had sewn his name into the lining of every garment he owned because he lost things, because small boys always lost things, because she used to laugh about it. The Duke was standing 12 feet away in the corridor with a ledger under his arm and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere past the wall. He did not move for a long moment. Then his jaw tightened, and he walked on without looking at anyone, and by the time he reached the end of the corridor he looked exactly like himself again. Mara watched him go and understood something she did not yet have the full shape of. He was not certain. He was performing certainty. There was a difference, and it mattered. Below stairs, Mara worked and watched. She had spent enough time in service to understand how a household revealed itself through its routines, what was done carelessly, what was done with too much care, what was never spoken of directly but communicated in the precise arrangement of who stood where during which conversations. Carrowmere Hall had a great deal to communicate. The first thing she noticed was Agnes's medicine. She had been sent to collect a tray of empty cups from outside the upper chamber door on her 4th morning, a task so minor that whoever assigned it had forgotten she could think while she carried things. The cup from Agnes's tray smelled wrong. Not unpleasant, precisely, but wrong, the way water smells wrong when something has been added to it that water does not naturally contain. She set it aside in her memory and said nothing. The second thing was the letters. She watched from the base of the servant's stair as a footman intercepted a packet of correspondence addressed in the Duke's name and carried it not to the study but to a side room off the west corridor, the room she had twice seen Lord Varick enter and exit at hours that did not align with any obvious duty. Lord Varick was a man of perhaps 60, still straight-backed, with the deliberate movements of someone who had spent decades ensuring that haste was never attributed to him. He had been at Carrowmere Hall so long that the younger servants spoke of him the way they spoke of the furniture. He had always been here. He belonged to the house. The third thing was Rosamund, and what Rosamund feared. Mara had no reason to be near the blue sitting room on a Tuesday afternoon except that the housekeeper had sent her to retrieve a candlestick and had given her the wrong corridor number, which meant Mara stood outside a door for 30 seconds listening before she understood where she was. Inside, Rosamund's voice was very quiet, which meant it was serious. "She is stronger than they expected," Rosamund was saying. "Then do what was done before," said Varick. The quantities were already cautious. "Increase them," said Rosamund, "until she cannot be believed." Mara returned to the correct corridor. She retrieved the candlestick. She carried it downstairs with steady hands and stood in the laundry alcove for a full minute before her breathing returned to normal. Later that week she found an opportunity to visit Agnes. The guards rotated in the early afternoon, and the new pair took 3 minutes longer than the old pair to settle into position, and 3 minutes was enough if she moved directly. Agnes was sitting up in bed, which was progress, wrapped in a good wool shawl that Mara suspected had been found in a trunk rather than bought new. The room was warm and overfurnished in the way of rooms designed to demonstrate comfort rather than provide it. Agnes looked at Mara and reached for her hand without preamble. "They are drugging me," Agnes said quietly. "I know. I am clearer some hours than others. When I am clear, I remember more." She pressed Mara's hand with thin fingers that were steadier than they had been behind the inn. "I refused to sign the estate transfer. That was when it began. Varick produced a physician, and the physician produced a compound, and within a fortnight I could not be certain what was real and what the compound had arranged for me to see. I was moved. I was moved again. Eventually I was simply released into the world because a woman who cannot reliably report her own name is less dangerous than a woman confined somewhere that can be found." Her eyes were very clear in that moment. Clear and exhausted and ancient with something that had not yet been allowed to become grief. "I spent 11 years trying to find my way back," she said. "I could only hold the truth clearly for days at a time before the effects returned. Someone was still dosing the water wherever I stopped. I only evaded it this last time by refusing to drink anything I had not drawn myself." Mara thought of the cup outside the chamber door. She thought of Varick in the West Room. She thought of the letters that never reached the Duke's desk. "I believe you," she said. Agnes looked at her with an expression that suggested being believed was not something she had encountered recently. "You should not have involved yourself in this," Agnes said. "It is too late for that now," said Mara. And she meant it practically. She was already involved. She was already watched. She might as well be useful. She tried to warn the Duke on a Thursday morning when she encountered him alone in the North Gallery. This happened because she had been sent to replace a flower arrangement and he had come to collect a particular book from the shelf beside the window, and for 40 seconds they were in the room without anyone else present, which she understood would not last. "My lord," she said before she could calculate whether it was wise. "The medicine given to Agnes has been tampered with. I smelled the compound in her cup. And letters addressed to you are being diverted to Lord Varick's room before they reach your desk. He took the book from the shelf and looked at the spine. You have been here 5 days, he said. Ample time to observe what you needed to in order to construct something useful to your position. I have no position. Precisely. Which makes acquiring one a natural interest. She held herself still. I did not ask to be brought here. And yet here you are. He turned, finally, and looked at her with the full attention he had been withholding, and it was more uncomfortable than being ignored had been, because it was thorough. He assessed her the way he read documents, looking for inconsistencies. You accuse my household of conspiracy on the basis of a smell and a footman's movements. I accuse what I saw. What you saw is filtered through a mind that has strong incentives to see particular things. Or through a mind that has no incentives at all, she said. I want nothing from this house. I want Agnes to be safe and I want to go back to Ravenshade, which is not a statement anyone seeking advantage would make. Something shifted in his expression, briefly and involuntarily, before the familiar control reasserted itself. You mistake persistence for honesty, he said, and left. But he did not leave easily. She could tell by the way he moved, slightly less certain than his usual geometry, that the conversation had cost him something. He had dismissed her. He had simply not quite finished dismissing what she said. In the days that followed he began, without any visible intention of doing so, to see things. He watched her hand a dropped shilling back to a merchant's assistant who had mocked her in the same breath as dropping it. He watched her kneel in the scullery corridor and rebandage the blistered hand of a young kitchen maid without being asked, without announcement, without anything that could be construed as performance. He heard her thank the cook by name for a plate of cold leftovers that she ate without complaint. He had people around him who feared him, people who needed him, people who wanted things from the proximity to his name. Mara Ellison appeared to want to get through the day without anyone suffering unnecessarily. He could not entirely account for her. The evening that Agnes hummed settled something in him that he was not ready to name. He had been passing her corridor at an hour when the household was quiet, and through the door, barely audible, came a melody. Simple, old, in a minor key that made the back of his throat tighten for a reason he could not immediately explain. Then he could. He had heard it exactly once before, at an age when he was young enough that music had entered him without permission. He stood in the corridor for nearly a minute, not moving, the melody working through him like something that had always been there and had simply been waiting for the right key. Then he walked on. He told himself, very firmly, that coincidence was not evidence. Across the hall, in her chamber, Rosamund stood at the window with her hands very still at her sides. She had watched the Duke pause outside the old woman's door from the far end of the corridor. She had seen what passed across his face in that unguarded moment. She turned from the window and sat at her writing desk and considered the situation with the cold and methodical intelligence she had been taught to hide behind softer presentations. Then she summoned her personal maid and gave a set of instructions that took less than 2 minutes to deliver and considerably longer to arrange. The last instruction was the simplest. The servant girl from the market, she said. Have her watched. Every room, every corridor, every conversation. She smoothed a crease from the letter she had been composing and did not look up. She is beginning to matter, and that cannot be allowed to continue. Chapter 3. The Jewel in the Apron. The formal dinner was announced on a Wednesday and held on a Friday, which gave Ravenshade's noble families exactly enough time to accept the invitation and not quite enough time to prepare questions they could ask politely. That was by design. Duke Caromir's solicitor delivered the invitations personally, each one sealed with the ducal crest and worded with the particular confidence of a man who did not expect refusals. The dinner was framed as a seasonal occasion, a gathering of county families, an evening of good food and correct society. What it actually was, and what every recipient understood it to be, was a demonstration. The rumors had been circulating for 10 days. An old woman, a servant girl, a scene at the Black Hart involving words that had not been spoken in Ravenshade for 16 years. Society had been patient, which for society meant approximately a week and a half, and now it wanted answers arranged on white linen with the good silver. They came in carriages that lined the approach road from gate to door. Ladies in winter silk. Gentlemen in formal black. A baronet from the eastern county who had no particular connection to the Caromere family but an excellent instinct for where interesting things were happening. They filed into the dining hall with the careful eagerness of people who have dressed for an occasion they expect to remember. The hall had been prepared with the kind of thoroughness that announces effort. Candles in silver branches down the length of the table. Flowers arranged in low bowls so that conversation could travel unobstructed. Crystal that caught the light and distributed it in small extravagances across the white cloth. The footmen were impeccable. The housekeeper had been awake since 4 in the morning. Mara had been assigned to wine service, which meant she moved along the length of the table with a decanter, refilling glasses, staying close to the wall when not pouring, making herself as geometrically small as the room allowed. The housekeeper had given her the assignment with an expression suggesting it was the least terrible of the available options. Mara understood. She was a known quantity in this household now, and known quantities needed to be placed somewhere visible rather than left to move freely. She wore the gray servant dress and kept her eyes on the glasses and tried to give the assembled guests as little to look at as possible. She was not entirely successful. Whispers followed the decanter down the table. There she is. The chapel girl. The one who made the scene. She kept her face neutral and her pouring steady and moved on. Rosamund sat at the Duke's right hand in sapphire silk that made her eyes look calculated and her diamonds look inevitable. She had chosen her jewelry with the specific care of someone who understood that objects carry arguments. At her throat sat a brooch of deep blue stones set in old gold, the kind of piece that belonged to families rather than individuals, the kind that accumulated history the way houses accumulated portraits. She had introduced it into conversation during the reception hour, mentioning to 2 separate guests that it had been a gift from the Caromere family, an heirloom entrusted to her keeping, a token of the connection between their households. Both guests had admired it appropriately. By the time dinner was served, the brooch had been noted by everyone at the table. Mara refilled a glass near the center of the table and moved toward the far end. The first course had been cleared. The second was being arranged by the kitchen staff with the controlled urgency of people who understood that timing in a formal dinner was the difference between seamless and noticed. She was near the sideboard when Rosamund made a sound. Not a dramatic sound. Something small and distressed, the sound of a woman discovering something unfortunate in the middle of a pleasant evening. She pressed one hand to her throat. Every eye at the table moved toward her with the reflex of people trained from birth to monitor the most important person in the room. "I am sorry," Rosamund said, with the expression of someone who is not sorry at all but has the grace to perform it. "I do not wish to create alarm." She looked down at her neckline. Then at the cloth beside her plate. Then with a slow and deliberate turn of her head, across the room toward the sideboard where Mara stood with the decanter. "My brooch," she said. "It is gone." The table exhaled. A baroness set down her fork. 2 gentlemen straightened in their chairs. The Duke looked at Rosamund, then at the table surface, then became very still. "I cannot think," Rosamund continued, her voice carrying with perfect regret, "where it might have gone. Except that I noticed this girl near my chair not a quarter hour ago." The room turned. Mara felt it before she saw it. The collective reorientation of a table full of people looking for somewhere to put their suspicion. She set the decanter down on the sideboard with care. "I was pouring wine," she said, "at the instruction of the housekeeper." "Of course," said Rosamund pleasantly. "Search her," said Lord Varick, from his seat near the foot of the table. He said it the way he said most things, as a conclusion rather than a suggestion. 2 footmen looked to the Duke. The Duke's jaw was set. He looked at Mara with an expression that was doing a great deal of internal work. "Search her," he said. The footman reached into the pocket of Mara's apron. The brooch came out in his hand, catching the candlelight as it emerged, blue stones bright and damning and exactly where it had been placed. The table's silence was the loudest thing in the room. There is a particular quality to the silence of a room full of people who believe they have just witnessed guilt confirmed. It is not empty silence. It is full of small sounds, the movement of fans, the adjustment of chairs, the particular rustle of clothing that accompanies collective satisfaction. Several guests at the Caromere table made those sounds. A woman near the center murmured something behind her glove. A gentleman across from her nodded with the gravity of someone who had suspected all along. Mara stood beside the sideboard with her hands at her sides and the brooch on the footman's palm between them, and she did not move. Rosamund rose from her chair with the measured composure of a woman who had prepared for this moment and found it meeting her expectations. She did not shout. Shouting would have been common. She spoke in the clear and sorrowful tone of someone performing reluctant justice, which was more effective and harder to argue with. "I did not wish to believe it," she said, addressing the table rather than Mara directly, which was its own kind of deliberate. A girl brought into this household under unusual circumstances. Given access to the family chambers. Positioned near guests of rank. She paused, letting the picture arrange itself in other people's minds. And not merely the brooch, I think. The entire story. The old woman. The scene at the inn. All of it constructed to gain proximity to this house. To gain protection. To gain whatever a girl with nothing can gain when she attaches herself to a family scandal. A baronet near the head of the table leaned forward with interest. A young woman in green silk looked at Mara with the bright attention of someone watching theater. Lord Varick rose from his chair with the deliberate gravity of a man who has been waiting for his moment and intends to use it correctly. "Your Grace," he said, "the case is plain. This girl has abused the hospitality of your household, stolen a family heirloom, and manufactured a falsehood calculated to destabilize your house at a vulnerable moment. I recommend she be remanded to the magistrate before morning." Several guests nodded. The baronet made a sound of agreement. The Duke sat at the head of the table with his hands flat on the white cloth and his face doing nothing legible. He looked at Varick. He looked at Rosamund. He looked at Mara. And for a moment that lasted long enough for the candles to register it, he did not speak. Mara looked back at him. She understood that her next words would be the last ones that mattered, and she chose them with the care of someone who has learned that dignity is not what you are given but what you refuse to surrender. "I have not owned anything worth stealing for nearly a year," she said. Her voice was level and did not ask anyone for anything. "I have scrubbed floors for crusts of bread. I have slept under a broken roof in January. I have carried coal from men who did not learn my name because it was not worth the effort." She did not look at the guests. She looked at the Duke. "In all of that time, I have never taken what did not belong to me. Not once. Because the one thing I have kept is the knowledge of what I am. And I am not a thief." The room was quiet in a different way now. The satisfied rustling had stilled. A woman near the center of the table lowered her fan. The baronet sat back slightly in his chair. Rosamund's composure did not crack, but something around the edges of it became effortful in a way it had not been before. Two guests exchanged a glance that did not mean what the glance at the beginning of the scene had meant. The Duke was still looking at Mara with that expression that refused to resolve into anything simple. Varick cleared his throat and began to speak again, and it was at that moment that the dining hall doors opened. Agnes walked in slowly, one hand on the doorframe, then released it and continued without support. She wore a dress that Mara had not seen before, old but carefully kept, dark gray with a high collar and cuffs that spoke of quality in the cut rather than the current condition of the cloth. Her hair had been dressed simply. She stood straight, which cost her something visible but which she paid without hesitation, and she walked the length of the dining hall in the silence that opened before her the way water opens before a stone. Guests turned in their chairs. A footman stepped back without being asked. Rosamund's hand moved involuntarily toward the empty setting at her throat and stopped. Agnes reached the center of the room and stood there, and the candlelight reached her from 3 directions, and everyone at the table had the same moment of seeing something in her face that did not belong in the category they had assigned her. "That brooch," Agnes said, looking at the footman's outstretched palm, "belongs to me." Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "It was made for my mother by a jeweler in Bath in 1804. It was given to me on the morning of my wedding and I have worn it on every significant occasion of my life." She looked at Rosamund with an expression that contained 16 years of patience arriving at its terminus. "It was in my possession until I was no longer in a position to keep anything." She reached into the shawl she wore over the gray dress and drew out a folded packet of papers. They were old, some of them, the folds worn soft with handling, and others were newer, written in different hands on different paper, accumulated over years with the persistence of someone who understood that truth requires documentation to survive in rooms like this one. She set them on the table nearest her and opened them one by one with steady hands. "These are letters written in my name that I did not write," she said. "Signed with my signature as it appeared after I had been drugged sufficiently to make my hand unreliable. You will see the difference if you compare them to the letters written before. Here are the physician's accounts, the payments made in the Caromir name for compounds administered without my knowledge or consent. Here are the estate transfer documents I refused to sign, followed by the date on which I was first confined. The correspondence between Lord Varick and the Holloway family solicitors begins approximately 3 weeks after that date." She placed the last paper on the table and looked up at the room. "My name is Helena Caromir. I am the Duchess of Caromir. I am the mother of the man sitting at the head of this table, and I have been absent from this house not by choice but by the deliberate and sustained effort of people who required my absence in order to maintain what they had taken." The dining hall was absolutely still. A candle at the far end of the table had burned low and no one moved to address it. Rosamund had not moved at all since Agnes began speaking. She stood with the particular stillness of someone calculating and finding the calculations increasingly inadequate. The Duke had risen from his chair at some point during Agnes's recitation and was standing at the head of the table with both hands on the cloth and his eyes moving across the documents that guests near him had silently begun to pass from hand to hand. A gentleman near the center held a letter up to the nearest candle branch and read it with the attention of a man who understood what he was reading and was troubled by it. A woman beside him did not need to read. She was watching Rosamund, and her expression had traveled a considerable distance from where it had been at the beginning of the evening. Lord Varick moved first, which was the tell. He pushed back his chair with an abruptness that had no grace in it and turned toward the far door with the momentum of a man who had already decided that dignity was a secondary concern. He had crossed perhaps 12 feet before the footman nearest the door stepped sideways and filled the gap. A second footman appeared from the service entrance. A third materialized near the window in a manner that suggested someone had anticipated exactly this. Varick stopped. He looked at the footman with the expression of a man discovering that the furniture has opinions. Behind him, 2 kitchen maids who had slipped into the doorway when Agnes entered were watching him with the flat attention of people who have spent years being treated as invisible and have decided to use it. The senior footman, a man named Aldred who had worked in the Caromir household for 11 years and had watched his own wages decrease by increments that Varick's ledger adjustments had made difficult to prove, looked at the old steward without a great deal of sympathy. "The Duke has not dismissed anyone," Aldred said. Varick turned to the room. He reassembled himself with effort, pulling the pieces of authority back into position, and when he spoke his voice was controlled and cold and aimed at the Duke with precision. "Your Grace, I have served this house for 30 years. I have protected its interests through the worst of its difficulties. What you are seeing tonight is a performance arranged by a woman whose mind has been unreliable for years and a servant girl with everything to gain. You are a man of intelligence. Do not allow sentiment to make you foolish." The Duke looked at him across the length of the table, and what was in his face was not sentiment. Rosamund moved toward the Duke's end of the table with the fluid urgency of someone repositioning on a field that has changed beneath them. She placed her hand on his arm with the practiced intimacy of a woman who has invested substantially in a particular outcome and is not ready to surrender it. "Edmund," she said, using his name with a familiarity that had always been presumption, "consider what it looks like. If you accept this woman's story, if you believe the word of a beggar girl over the structure of everything you have known, you will look as though you have been manipulated. Society will not forgive that. I can help you manage this. We can announce that the impostor has been dealt with. We can—" "Take your hand off my arm," the Duke said. She did, slowly. He picked up the nearest document. He read it for a long moment in silence, and whatever he found there worked through his expression in a way he did not attempt to conceal. He set it down and picked up another. When he put the second one down, his hands were not entirely steady. He looked at Varick, then at Rosamund, then at the room full of people who were watching him with the total attention of an audience that understood they were present at something that would be recounted for years, and he made the decision to give them an accurate account of it. "Lord Varick," he said, "you are under arrest. For fraud, for theft of estate funds, for the unlawful confinement of a member of this family, and for 30 years of counsel given in the service of your own interest rather than this house." Varick opened his mouth. Aldred stepped forward and he closed it again. "Our engagement," the Duke said, turning to Rosamund, is ended. Her chin came up. You cannot, I have. She looked at the room. She looked at the faces that had been her allies 20 minutes ago and found them rearranged into something less useful. Her composure cracked along a single line, not dramatically but definitively, the way fine porcelain cracks, all at once and irreparably. You ungrateful man, she said, with the particular fury of someone who has mistaken strategy for affection and is only now learning the difference. Everything I did was to protect what you would have lost without me. What you did, he said, was ensure there was something left to take. He looked at his guards. She was escorted from the dining hall with her diamonds and her composure and the wreckage of everything she had arranged, and her departure left a silence that the room did not immediately fill. The Duke stood at the head of the table and looked across the length of it to where Mara stood beside the sideboard, still in the grey servant dress, the decanter still on the cloth beside her, her hands at her sides and her face doing what it had done through all of it, holding itself together not because nothing had reached her but because she had decided what she was and intended to remain it. He looked at her for a long moment. Not as a problem. Not as a factor. Not as an element of a situation requiring management. He looked at her the way a man looks when he is arriving, finally, at the correct understanding of something he has been wrong about for some time. The girl who had owned nothing, who had been brought into this house as a suspicion and kept in it as an inconvenience, who had been mocked at by women in silk and dismissed by men of title and assigned the worst tasks by a household that considered her beneath its notice, had been the only person in Ravenshade willing to stand between an old woman and the cold. She had been the only one who saw what everyone else was paid not to see. She had stood in this room tonight and refused to collapse under the weight of a lie that had every advantage over her, and she had remained exactly what she was. He understood, in that moment, with the clarity that comes only when all the arranged furniture of a long deception is finally moved aside, that the girl he had treated worst had deserved the most. And the cost of that understanding settled over him in the candlelight with the quiet, irrevocable weight of truth. Chapter 4. The Duke Who Knelt. The guests were gone by midnight. The carriages had filed down the approach road one after another, carrying enough scandal to sustain Ravenshade's drawing rooms through the remainder of winter and well into spring. The dining hall had been cleared by silent and efficient staff who moved through the wreckage of the evening with the practiced speed of people accustomed to cleaning up after other people's crises. By the time the last candle branch was extinguished and the last door closed, Carrowmere Hall was quiet in the way that only large houses can be quiet, completely, and with the particular weight of everything that has just occurred still present in the air. The Duke found Helena in the small sitting room at the end of the east corridor, the one that had been his mother's room when he was a boy, though he had not permitted himself to think of it that way for 16 years. She was sitting in the chair nearest the fire with a blanket across her knees, and when he entered she looked up at him with an expression that contained so many things simultaneously that he had to look away before he could look back. He closed the door. He remained standing because sitting would have required a decision about where, and every chair in this room carried a memory he had spent 2 decades refusing. You should rest, he said. It was not what he meant to say. I have had a great deal of rest forced upon me, Helena answered. I find I prefer to be awake. He moved to the window. Outside, the last of the carriages was passing through the gate, its lamp swinging in the dark. I believe them, he said. His voice was flat in the way of voices that are being held very carefully. I know. I was 9 years old and I believed them, and then I was 19 and I still believed them, and then I was a grown man with a title and an estate and the full authority of my name, and I continued to believe them because stopping would have meant that everything I had built on top of it was built on nothing. Yes, she said. I hated you, he said. The words came out without ceremony, and he did not try to soften them because softening them would have been a lie, and he had had enough of those. Every year I was certain you had chosen to leave. That we had not been sufficient. That I had not been sufficient. I built this coldness on that certainty, and I aimed it at everyone beneath me because they were available and you were not. Helena did not flinch. She had had 16 years to prepare for this conversation, and she had understood it would not be easy. She had not come back for easy. I spent those same years trying to reach you, she said. Not 1 week passed without the attempt. I sent letters that never arrived. I found people willing to carry messages who were intercepted before they cleared the county. I came as close as Ravenshade twice in 3 years and was moved before morning both times. Something in his jaw shifted. When I finally came on my own, with nothing left of my health and very little left of my coherence, it was because I had decided that dying in the attempt was preferable to not making it. He turned from the window then. He looked at her in the firelight and saw, for the first time without the interference of everything Varric had constructed between them, what 16 years of that had cost her. The frailty of her. The patience of a woman who had held onto one true thing for so long that it had become the only thing keeping her assembled. His throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with control. I have been cruel, he said, to people who deserved none of it. Tenants. Servants. People who had nothing and from whom I took more. Yes, she said, again, because she loved him, and love, real love, does not perform comfort at the expense of truth. Pain explains cruelty, she said carefully. It does not pardon it. You were wounded and you were lied to and you were raised by a man who needed you brittle. All of that is true. None of it is sufficient. He received that in silence. Then he crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite her, and for a long time they remained there, mother and son on either side of a fire, with 16 years between them and the slow and difficult work of truth beginning to move through the space where the lie had been. He came to Mara the following morning with an envelope. She was in the laundry corridor, which was where she had been assigned until someone decided otherwise, and when he appeared she did not startle because she had been half expecting something and had spent the night determining how she would respond to whatever it was. The envelope was thick. She could tell without opening it. For your trouble, he said, and for your discretion. There is enough there to establish yourself respectably. A room somewhere decent. References I will write personally, which will open any household in the county to you. He said it with the manner of a man who believes he is being generous, because he was, by the measures he had been taught to apply. Mara looked at the envelope. She did not take it. I see, she said. He waited. You believe this settles it, she said. Not an accusation. An observation which was worse. I believe it is a beginning, he said carefully. It is a payment, she said, which is not the same thing. She looked at him with the directness she had never abandoned regardless of who was in the room. Your Grace, I do not want your money. I want Ravenshade to change. He was quiet. The wash house behind the East Market, she said. There are 3 families sleeping in it currently, because it is the only structure in that part of the town that offers any shelter at all, and it has a broken roof and no fire. The children who stand near the bakery gates every morning are not there because they enjoy the smell. The servants dismissed from houses across this county without references are dismissed because stewards like Varric discovered that frightened workers cost less than secure ones, and no one with authority over those stewards has required them to behave otherwise. She took a breath. Your mother was hidden in plain sight for 16 years because this county's systems were arranged to make certain kinds of people invisible. I was one of those people before she was. There are hundreds more who have no Duke's mother to expose the machinery on their behalf. He stood very still. You saved her, she said. Or rather, you allowed the truth to save her, which is what you should have done from the beginning. That matters. But if the estate returns to its previous management of human beings the moment the scandal fades, then what happened in that dining hall last night was theater, not change. She met his eyes without wavering. I will not be paid to be quiet about that. If you want to settle a debt, settle it with Ravenshade. The envelope remained in his hand. Something in his face moved through several expressions and arrived at one she had not seen on him before. Not anger. Not the controlled assessment he used when he was deciding what to do with a situation. Something closer to recognition. He looked at her the way a man looks when he finally understands what kind of person he is standing in front of. What would you have me do? He said, and it was a genuine question, specifically. She told him. Spring came to Ravenshade with the particular surprise it always carries in a county that has spent 4 months convinced warmth is theoretical. Snow retreated from the rooftops slowly, then all at once. The market fountains cleared. The roads dried. And with the changing of the season came changes that the town watched with the cautious attention of people who have learned not to trust good news until it has repeated itself several times. The estate audit took 6 weeks and produced results that made the Duke's solicitors pale and his sense of his own history considerably darker. False debts were identified and cancelled. Tenants who had been paying interest on amounts that bore no relationship to their original agreements received written corrections and, in cases of long-standing hardship, formal compensation. Servants dismissed without cause or reference over the previous decade were located where possible and offered both. Mill workers whose wages had been adjusted downward through ledger alterations that Varick had introduced gradually enough to pass without scrutiny received the difference in a single payment that several of them stood holding for some minutes before they could speak. Lord Varick faced a magistrate in March and a court in May and the complete legal ruin of everything he had accumulated by autumn. Rosamund's family, whose solicitors had drafted the estate transfer agreements and whose accounts held funds moved from Carrowmere in the years following Helena's disappearance, faced a parallel process that was quieter but no less thorough. Society discussed it with great enthusiasm and careful distance. The washhouse behind the East Market was the first building the Duke rebuilt, which was noted and remembered. The structure that replaced it was solid, properly roofed, with a working hearth and a dry storeroom and enough beds to shelter 14 people at once. Adjacent to it, constructed over what had been a vacant lot used primarily for the storage of broken carts, rose a refuge for women dismissed from service, for girls with nowhere to go, for those caught in the particular trap of being too poor to recover without help and too proud to stop trying. Mara ran it. She ran it with the specificity of someone who had slept in its predecessor and the authority of someone who had been given real resources and a mandate she intended to use completely. She knew which walls let in cold and why. She knew which girls needed a meal first and a conversation second and which needed the reverse. She hired women who had themselves been dismissed without cause, paying them properly and keeping records that could withstand scrutiny, because she had learned in the Carrowmere household what happened when records could not. She received education in the mornings, languages and law and accounting, delivered by tutors who had been briefed to treat her as a student rather than a curiosity. She dressed better, because warmth and cleanliness are not vanity, and because she had decided that she would not perform poverty to make other people comfortable. She remained entirely herself, which the Duke found, with increasing frequency, to be the most remarkable thing about any room she entered. Helena's title was formally restored in April at a proceeding that drew more observers than it had any legal reason to. She attended in a dark blue dress that the Carrowmere seamstress had made from a fabric she chose herself, and she signed her name in the court register with the steady hand of a woman who had been practicing it in her mind for 16 years. Afterward, she took Mara's arm as they descended the courthouse steps, and told her that the garden at Carrowmere Hall had been badly managed and she intended to restore it, and would Mara like to help choose what was planted? Mara said yes. The Duke, walking behind them, said nothing, but the expression he wore for the remainder of that afternoon was observed by his secretary, his solicitor, and 3 separate footmen, none of whom had ever seen it on his face before. Winter returned to Ravenshade in December, and with it the grandest ball Carrowmere Hall had held in living memory. The invitations went out 6 weeks in advance and were accepted within days, because society had spent a year watching the Duke of Carrowmere become something it had not anticipated and was eager to observe the next development at close range. The hall was dressed in evergreen and white roses, candles in every bracket, fires in every hearth. Musicians in the upper gallery played waltzes that drifted down through the warm air and settled over the assembled guests like weather. Ladies arrived in their best. Gentlemen wore their medals. The baronet from the eastern county came again, having correctly identified Carrowmere Hall as a location where history had a habit of occurring. At 8:30, Mara descended the main staircase. She wore ivory, simply cut, with no ornament beyond the small clasp that Helena had pressed into her hands that afternoon without explanation, closing Mara's fingers around it and saying only that it had been waiting for the right occasion for some time. Her hair was dressed with winter blossoms. She carried nothing else. The room noticed her before she had descended 6 steps. Conversation did not stop all at once but thinned, the way sound thins when attention moves elsewhere, and by the time she reached the bottom of the staircase the guests nearest the stairs had oriented toward her with the involuntary reflex of people in the presence of something they had not fully prepared for. These were the same people who had whispered behind their fans at the Black Hart Inn. The same ones who had watched her stand accused in the dining hall with a planted jewel in her apron and satisfaction arranged across their faces. They looked at her now with something more complicated, the particular recalibration of people who have been wrong about something in public and are deciding how to manage the fact. The Duke crossed the ballroom toward her. He moved through the crowd with the directness of a man who has decided what he is doing and sees no reason to obscure it, and guests stepped aside for him not from fear, as they once had, but from the recognition that something was happening that deserved space. He reached her beneath the chandelier at the center of the room. The orchestra in the gallery softened without being asked. He extended his hand. She took it. They danced, and the room watched, and the watching was a different kind than any that had come before. When the music ended, he did not release her hand. He held it and looked at her in the candlelight with an expression that had nothing performed in it, nothing managed, nothing arranged for an audience. Then he did what she had not expected and what the room had not anticipated either. He knelt. Gasps moved through the assembled guests like a current. A woman near the wall pressed her hand to her mouth. The baronet, to his credit, stood very straight and said nothing. "I have nothing to offer you that you have not already shown you can live without," the Duke said. "Not comfort, because you were never destroyed by the lack of it. Not security, because you built your own from nothing. Not rescue, because you were never waiting to be rescued." He looked up at her steadily. "I offer only what I am becoming, which is better than what I was, because you required it of me, honestly and without flattery and without any reason except that it was true." The ballroom was absolutely still. Helena stood near the far wall with her hands clasped and her eyes bright, watching her son kneel on the marble floor of the house she had spent 16 years trying to return to, and she did not try to conceal what was in her face. Mara looked down at him. She thought of the snow behind the Black Hart Inn, of the cold of the washhouse floor and the smell of the dying fire and an old woman's hand reaching toward her in the dark. She thought of everything that had followed, the marble corridors and the gray dress and the planted jewel and the long patient work of watching a man learn to see clearly. She thought of what she had told him that morning in the laundry corridor, that an apology means nothing unless something changes, and she looked at Ravenshade's changed rooftops through the tall windows and at the man kneeling before her and understood that he had meant it. "Yes," she said, "but you should know I will continue to tell you the truth when you are wrong." He almost smiled. "I am counting on it." He rose and took her hand, and the ballroom erupted, and the musicians above them made a sound like joy-given structure, and Helena laughed for the first time in 16 years with her whole heart and no apology. And in the warm light of Carrowmere Hall, the girl who had once pressed herself against a bakery wall to breathe the smell of bread she could not afford stood openly beside the man whose cruelty she had walked into and whose humanity she had refused to stop believing in, and Ravenshade, which had learned to look through her, learned at last to see. Thanks for listening to the end. If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. There's another one waiting for you on the screen. Click it, keep listening, and stay in this world a little longer. And if you haven't already, drop a like, share, and subscribe. We're on the way to 3,000 subscribers. Be part of it.